Good morning, children, and welcome to our today's session of English classroom for class 11. Uh, we have taken the lesson for today from supplementary reader snapshot, the first lesson of the book, The Address by Margot Minko. As the name suggests, the address, the whole story actually centers around a particular address. The setting of the story is in Holland, post-war, Second World War period. And as you know, that during the Second World War, the Nazi ruler, they tortured the Jews around the world. And the same story, being no exception, the same thing was found in European countries also. So we'll see in this story how the Jews had to suffer. Okay. Now first we'll see about the author. This is here you can see the picture, okay, of the author Margot Minko. Now Margot Minko, pseudonym of Sarah Menko. Actually, the spelling of this surname was Menko. Born 31 March 1920, is a Dutch journalist and writer. Her real surname was Menko, but an official accidentally switched the first vowel. She was born in Gineken to an Orthodox Jewish family. Okay, so this is very important that she belonged to the Jews community. Okay, in 1957, Minko published her first book, Het Bitter Kruid, the bitter herb, which means in English. Okay, now we'll come to the lesson. First, we'll have an overview of the whole lesson. What is it about? As we know that war brings no prosperity, but it brings all turmoil and all damage. The same thing had happened after the Second World War also. As I told you, the Jews around the world was being attacked by the Nazis during Second World War, and this story actually is based on the backdrop of that. Okay, now Mrs. S was a Jew, actually, is a rich lady. Mrs. Darling was a non-Jew, and the narrator of this lesson was the daughter of Mrs. S. So three important characters that you get in this story. Mrs. S. This is Mrs. S. This is the name of the mother. Her daughter is a narrator of the story, and we will get another important character, that is Mrs. Darling, who was non-Jew. Now, during the war, Second World War, when the Jews were attacked, being a Jew, Mrs. S and her family members had to flee away. Okay, leave their own paternal house, their house and everything belongings. And during that time, Mrs. Darling, who was actually an old acquaintance of Mrs. S, she wanted to take the advantage of the whole situation, as she knew that the Jews are going to leave their house, their property. So, on the pretext of being the old acquaintance of Mrs. S, she assured Mrs. S that her belongings will be kept in safe custody with her till everything becomes normal. So all her the valuable belongings of Mrs. S was being brought by Mrs. Darling. Okay, and the narrator also, when she was very young at that time, but she had seen everything, and her mother told her before death that about Mrs. Darling and their belongings which is being kept in her house. Now, the narrator, when she grew up, she wanted to see, wanted to have their possessions, and that's why she came. But how she was being treated by Mrs. Darling at that time, and what was the consequences is the subject matter of the whole story. Now we'll go to the introduction of the lesson. Okay, the story is about the human predicament, the suffering, okay, that follows the pre-war and post-war period. Mrs. S, who was a Jew, was a rich lady, whereas Mrs. Darling was a non-Jew. The girl, daughter of Mrs. S, had lost her house and her mother during the war. Now she had decided to come back. Now her return, okay. She wanted to come back and to have her, to take her possessions from Mrs. Darling, who was an old acquaintance whose address was given by her mother years ago. When she reached the house, whose house? Mrs. Darling's house, and the address of this house is house number 24, Marconi Street. The women treated her with a cold reception and didn't let her into the house. Now there is a method in it. Why she did that? Because if she allows her, if she called her, allow her to enter her house, then she will, recognize her, the narrator's possessions, and automatically she must have to hand over those things. So that fear, due to that fear, she didn't want to lose, those belongings, isn't it? So that's why Mrs. Darling didn't want to, receive him, and didn't want to treat with the narrator nicely. She now decided to go back anyway, and then she met her daughter, who let her in and told her to wait inside. Now what happened? Next day before leaving that place, she thought that once she should go and talk to Mrs. Darling, okay. But when she reached there, she decided to go back again. There at that time Mrs. Darling was not at home, so her daughter received her and told her to wait inside. When she entered into the house and saw all the old possessions, all her possessions in front of her, she couldn't connect with them and decided to leave the house. Now she was very much unhappy looking at those. She became very much nostalgic because things, old possessions of her, actually those had some associated memories, isn't it? So from the childhood, with the things with which she was brought up, when those things came before her, she became nostalgic, and moreover she saw that those nice belongings, their belongings were being kept in very untidy manner, okay, that actually hurt her, and finally she decided to not to go away from there and never to possess all those things. Okay. Now summary, you will see after ringing the doorbell of Mrs. Darling, who lived at number 40. Sorry, the address is 46 Marconi Street. The protagonist, who was given a cold reception, and Mrs. Darling took much time to recognize her. Mrs. Darling had thought everyone in the protagonist's family was dead, and asked if anyone else had come along with her. Now, Mrs. Darling refused to let the protagonist here the narrator, inside her house, and told her to, come back sometime later. The protagonist recognized her mother's green cardigan, which Mrs. Darling was wearing at that time, isn't it? So when Mrs. Darling didn't want to recognize her and behaved in such a way that as if she was a stranger, at that time she could recognize her mother's means the narrator's mother's green cardigan, which Mrs. Darling was wearing at that time. So she decided to go back to the train station. She said nothing, and rather she decided to go back to the train station and thought about her mother, and how she told her about Mrs. Darling, who was an old acquaintance of hers. During the war, Mrs. Darling would visit their house and take their possessions with her, as she decided she didn't want them to get lost if they ever left the place. Now, actually, Mrs. Darling, as I told you, that under the pretext of being the old acquaintance, she took the advantage and told her that the things will be safe in her safe custody till they return back. But when the narrator reached over there, she behaved as if she couldn't recognize her. Now the protagonist decided to go to Mrs. Darling's house to get back their belongings. When she rang the bell, Mrs. Darling's daughter answered at the door. She let her in and asked her to wait in the living room. When they were crossing the passage, the protagonist noticed their Hanukkah candle stand that they had never used because it had been unmanageable. When she now entering there, she one by one she was finding her old possession. Actually, that was making me very much nostalgic. Now, first thing, the Hanukkah candle stand, okay, which they rarely used to use because it was very much unmanageable. When she reached the living room, she was horrified as she saw all her mother's things that were arranged in the tasteless manner. The furniture was ugly and the room was had a muggy smell, and it made her disinterested and she wanted to leave the place. Now Mrs. Darling's daughter offered her a cup of tea, and the protagonist noticed the old tablecloth that had a burn mark on it. That burn mark was still there. Okay, now in this way everything, silver fork and the spoon that actually belonged to the narrator, the protagonist, she also, and finally what happened, she decided not to visit the place again as it brought back memories of the past, and hence she decided to forget the address. So this is overall summary of the lesson. Okay, now finally a little bit explanation of the last part. The girl made her sit, that we already have seen, to find herself in the room she knew and didn't know. This is important to know, that she was there in a room that she knew but actually didn't know. Why she knew? Because all those belongings were known to her, and she didn't know because the home, the way that has been arranged in a tasteless manner, that was really was not known to her, and she didn't like that actually. Okay, and that actually troubled her in the strange, in that atmosphere. She was getting a kind of trouble. Now she had no courage to look around her, but she no longer had the desire also to possess those. She got up, walked to the door and left the room. She resolved to forget the address and moved on. Now why she decided to forget the address? Because the things which could be seen around her all had that childhood memories, isn't it? And when she looked, she found her in the midst of those things in that room. She was very much nostalgic, and that's why finally she thought that I should leave this place. Okay, as usual, now I'll go to the text. Okay, I'll explain a little bit, and in this way, in part 1, 2 and 3 we'll complete this lesson. The first sentence of the of this lesson, do you still know me? I asked. The narrator asked that if she could. She means who? Mrs. Darling could recognize her. The woman looked at him searchingly as if she couldn't understand or recognize her. No, I don't know you. I'm Mrs. S's daughter. Okay, Mrs. S's daughter. Okay. Now she held her hand on the door as though she wanted to prevent it opening any further. She kept staring at me in silence because she actually deliberately behaving in such a way as if she couldn't recognize her, isn't it? Because the reason is that once she said that I could recognize you, immediately she must have to return those things, because she promised her mother, Mrs. S, that she would return her valuable possession after the war, or after the war means when the situation will become normal. Okay, perhaps I was mistaken. I thought perhaps it isn't her. Her behavior was such shocking, isn't it, that it made the narrator to feel that as if she were in the wrong address, isn't it? But later on she was but when she could see, she was wearing my mother's green knitted cardigan. Okay, the wooden buttons were rather pale from washing. She saw that I was looking at the cardigan, half hid herself again behind the door, and now she understood that she could, recognize that cardigan of her mother's indeed, that she was hiding her behind the door. But I knew how that was right. Okay, now, but I knew now that I was right. It means what? I knew now that I was in the right address. Now the meaning, a few words: chink, narrow opening. The door is talking about the narrow opening of the door, and fleetingly for a short time. Now we'll go to the next part of the text. Few things that conversation are there. Have you come back? Now see the surprising question that the woman, said the woman means Mrs. Darling. I thought that no one had come back. Okay, she was wishing actually that no one should come back, so that she must not to return the things. Now I regret I can't. Now she said that I regret I can't do anything for you. The narrator said, I have come here specially on the train. I wanted to talk to you for a moment. Mrs. Darling said, it's not convenient for me now. I can't see you. Another time. Come some another time. Oh, nothing, the woman would have said. It was nothing. Now a sound came from inside. The room was there waiting outside the room she was talking. Maybe her daughter. Her daughter means Mrs. Darling's daughter, who was inside the house and asking that with whom she was talking. So she said abruptly that, oh, nothing, it's nothing. Okay. I looked at the nameplate again. Now before leaving that address, she means our narrator looked at the nameplate again. What is written there? Darling. It said, it was written Darling in black letter on white enamel, and on the jamb a bit higher the number 46. Marconi Street was that place. So this much we have done. We will continue in our next class from the next part. I wish that you will go through the text, listen this audio play and this one, and it will help you out. Few questions I had given for homework. What is the address referred to here in the lesson? Who was Mrs. Darling and why didn't she entertain the narrator in a house? So in this way, I suppose that you, by listening our conversation, you can easily answer the questions. So see in our next class. Okay, thank you very much.